Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's open forum for the Housing Accountability and Production Office. Thank you all for taking time out of your afternoon to join us here on this Monday afternoon. We'll wait just a couple of moments before we dive in to our meeting here. So again, thanks for joining us. It's kind of slowed down here as far as folks joining us. So let's go ahead and get started this afternoon. Again, good afternoon. My name is Joel Madsen. I'm the manager of the Housing Accountability and Production Office. Thank you again for spending some time on this Monday afternoon with our team, and where we'll be diving in to some of the model code work that HAPO has been engaging in. Before we jump into that content, just a reminder, we have these open forums every other month. Our colleagues at the Housing Division host open forums the months that HAPO do not. So on the even number months, the Housing Division has their open forums. Odd number months, the Housing Accountability and Production Office is hosting these open forums. And it really is this opportunity for our office to share some of the latest activities that we think are relevant to interested parties around the state. And I would say more importantly, your opportunity to engage with us and ask us questions and get to know the teammates that are working at HAPO. So with that, I'd like to take a minute just to allow HAPO teammates to introduce themselves who are on the call before we hand it over to Sean to dive into our content presentation here this afternoon. So I'll pass it over to Kieran.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Kieran Turnbull with the Housing Accountability and Production Office. And I think I see maybe Rachel's on the call. Or anyone else on HAPO. Feel free to jump in to introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. I'm Rachel Six. I'm a housing planner with HAPO. I'm not sure who else is on the call, so anyone else on the team, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And we have some colleagues from the Building Codes Division who serve on in HAPO as well. But if you'd like to come off mute and introduce yourselves, please feel free.
Hi, everyone. I'm Richard Donovan. I work for the Building Codes Division of DCBS.
Sean, let's hand it over to you and dive into the content presentation we have for folks this afternoon. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. And yeah, hi, everybody. So my name is Sean Edging. I'm a housing planner with the Housing Accountability and Production Office. So today, for today's presentation, we decided that we wanted to focus in on a project that we're going to be working on over this year that relates to or kind of builds on work that our office in DLCD has done in relationship to model ordinances. That was something that we were directed to do in 2025, and LCDC adopted a set of model ordinances. I'll talk about that. And then, of course, to talk about some of the work to come around model ordinances designed to help local governments in implementing different housing laws that the legislature has adopted. So with that, I'll start just with like some kind of basic like housekeeping pieces. You know, we'll include this on any one of our presentations. So we're going to have a few points in this presentation where we will, stop and pause for kind of questions, Q&A, and of course at the end of the meeting, we'll really just kind of open it up for any topics, including, model ordinance or otherwise, for folks to be able to connect with us. And we ask that you do this in one of two ways. One way is by, raising your hand. You might be familiar with that if you've done virtual meetings in the past, to help kind of get you in the queue to talk or pose questions to us. And then another through a kind of Q&A function that exists also here to, enable you guys to pose questions to us. We'll ask that you use either one of these two functions and not to use the chat, because we are not as able to kind of track that and kind of track your questions and whether we're responding to them in time. So it's just a request on our end, just so that we can respond to your question in a timely fashion. And then, of course, just a thing to know is after this meeting, we will share slides that we have in this meeting. And of course, this is being recorded right now to be posted on DLCD's YouTube page. So for folks who missed this presentation, of course, they will be able to kind of, tune in and view this after the fact as well. So with that, let's just move really quickly into the agenda. So the main kind of substance of today's meeting is really around kind of talking through model ordinances and talking through some work that we anticipate doing this year to help kind of build on an existing set of model ordinances that LCDC adopted in 2025. Of course, to do that, we'll have to set up some context for those who might not have been tracking that process, like what are model ordinances? What was the direction to LCDC and to DLCD in producing model ordinances? And how are they used? What was adopted? How are they used? What's the functionality of them? And then once we establish that context, we'll kind of move more into where we are going. So talking through like, all right, we have these model ordinances that were created. What are we going to do now in 2026? The short answer is we're going to focus on kind of implementation modules that help local governments comply with different housing laws that the legislature has adopted. And we'll talk through individually, like what are those different laws that we'll be preparing model code kind of implementation modules for. Of course, we'll also just kind of open it up after that point for kind of office hours, Q&A. Of course, folks can ask questions about what we present on, but even broader than that, this is kind of just an opportunity for folks to bring forward what they're seeing in the field, any questions they have of us. They can be anything. And so we'll have that opportunity. And then after that point, we'll just, we'll close it out once we've kind of finished up our agenda. So with that, I'll start by setting up the context for us for these model ordinances that exist today, including kind of explaining the origin, like where model ordinances were directed to be developed. That's Senate Bill 1564. And then talking through kind of some of the administrative rules that were adopted at the end of last year that implement model ordinances and prescribe kind of different functions to model ordinances today. And we'll really be focusing in on kind of one key provision that's relevant to HAPO that's designed really to help local governments implement different housing laws that the legislature adopted. So let's start with the bill context. So this is Senate Bill 1564. This was adopted in the 2024 session. And it directed the Land Conservation and Development Commission. For those who don't know, LCDC is the state's kind of land use related commission that makes, kind of like policy decisions around a lot of things that relate to land use, including different housing laws that relate to land use. And the direction to them was to develop a set of model ordinances that the commission adopts by January 1st of 2026. And specifically, it directed LCDC to produce model ordinances for 4 different housing types that were specified in the bill: detached single unit, accessory dwelling unit, middle housing, which is secretly 5 housing types, and then multi-unit. And it also directed the commission to adopt it for kind of 3 different population-sized communities. One for small cities, cities with a population below 2,500. One for kind of medium-sized cities, cities with a population between 2,500 and 25,000. And then one for large cities, cities with a population of 25,000 or greater. And of course, in addition to that, to kind of stitch everything together and to be able to kind of fulfill different procedural requirements and reviewing different applications under the model code, there were a set of model procedures that were included to kind of help stitch everything together. Now, these model codes have kind of 4 different primary functions that are spelled forth in statute. I won't cover them right now because each of our next slides is going to talk about each kind of functionality of the model code in detail. So we'll just kind of sit on that for a minute. But the thing to know is that this bill was implemented. The Land Conservation and Development Commission, they adopted these codes at the end of December of last year. And as of kind of January 1st of 2026, these codes are adopted and effective. This link that we have kind of here in the bottom right, this is where you can access kind of existing drafts of this. And of course, they also exist in the administrative rule themselves as an attachment to rule. All right, so that's the bill direction. The way that these were kind of implemented in administrative rules, there were kind of different rules that outlined different statutory functions that are outlined elsewhere in law and kind of provided parameters around, well, what does this mean? How is this implemented, right? What are the details, right? And I'll start by talking about this first functionality of the code, which is optional adoption by reference. This is something that Senate Bill 1564 included or implemented authority for local governments, specifically cities, to be able to do. So after LCDC adopted these codes, one of the functions that the legislature kind of gave cities the ability to do was to adopt a model code in whole or in part by reference. Basically, the idea is that rather than kind of taking a model code and then incorporating different provisions into their own sets of codes at the local level, this provides kind of an off-the-shelf option for local governments to, take a model code. If, let's say, they're really jazzed about, say, accessory dwelling units, they can specify the locations, the residentially zoned locations where the code would apply, and they can say, all right, we're going to adopt this by reference and basically kind of lean on the state-provided model code instead of kind of developing their own code de novo. I'll add that this is really intended to kind of be a tool that's really supposed to be supportive for small communities in particular. Think like communities that might even lack just like a planning staff person. They might have like a city recorder or a city administrator, right? Something like that. And, they might not have the technical expertise to like take on a set of code amendments or even to submit request for support from DLCD through like a grant to do code amendments, right? But the intent, right, is to really provide a tool that gives different cities the ability, if they want to opt in or they want to, select the location where maybe they're really excited about a particular housing type, they've got a code that's been vetted by the state, complies with all the different housing laws that we have, and they can kind of take that off the shelf and be able to allow different housing options in their community. Of course, this is also available for larger cities too, but generally speaking, larger cities have more kind of resources to be able to kind of do code amendments or request technical assistance from DLCD to support code amendments, right? So they might be more inclined to kind of like borrow from the code or incorporate it into their own, but maybe not adopt by reference, though it's available to them. Something that I'll add on this functionality is that kind of as one of our tasks in 2026, we're currently working on some kind of guidance materials that are intended to help support any cities that want to try, to adopt parts of the code or incorporate these model codes into their own efforts, and working on different guidance documents that we'll be preparing over the next couple of months, and publishing to help support or aid local implementation of that. So that's just one note I wanted to include in there. All right. The next function of model code, and I'll add, this is what we're really going to focus on primarily in today's presentation. This one's around housing law compliance, and I have to do a little bit of setup for folks to understand this. So the big thing that this rule does is it implements a statute that is kind of something that's always kind of in the background around different housing laws that the legislature adopts. So I'm sure many of the folks on this call are aware that the legislature has adopted a whole host of housing laws over the past 5-6 years or even longer that are intended to help kind of facilitate the production of housing, right? And kind of as part of that, there's a question of like, all right, now that these laws are adopted, how are they actually implemented on the ground? And there's a statute that provides what actually happens. It's ORS Chapter 197, Section 646. And basically what it says is once the legislature adopts a new law, specifically around housing law in this case, but it doesn't specify that. This is just general. Local governments are required to basically conform their local codes to comply with that law. And if they don't, they have to apply that law directly to land use decisions. So if there's a new law that's passed and a local government does not codify those amendments or conform with those amendments, what they would be required to do is to implement that statute directly to their land use decisions, right, in order to comply or conform with the law. Now, something to know about that is that can be very risky at times or very confusing to do at times, right? It takes a lot of savvy to be able to take a law, understand that it applies to a development project, and then apply that law directly, kind of notwithstanding local code provisions, right? And most local governments are in different stages of conforming or not conforming with housing laws. There's a lot of them, right? And so kind of as a consequence of that, this can create a pretty legally kind of tricky landscape to implement all these different laws that the legislature is trying to adopt, right? So what this rule basically does is it says, hey, we have these model code modules that can implement these different housing laws. And if a local code maybe isn't conforming with the law or would violate a housing law, an option that exists that's provided by this rule is that a local government could choose to apply a module of a model ordinance that's relevant to the law in question. An example of this would be middle housing land divisions. So House Bill 2138 kind of made a lot of changes to middle housing land divisions, and a lot of local governments kind of hadn't codified middle housing land divisions, which would mean that a lot of cities would be in kind of a position where if they got a middle housing land division application, they would have to apply the law directly, notwithstanding their local code, and that could be really confusing. So one of the provisions that is in this code is a module that implements specifically middle housing land divisions. So an option that local governments have under this rule is the ability to take that module and apply it while either they're working on their own code amendments to kind of come into conformance with the law, or if maybe they don't have the resources for that, they can rely on this statute to be vetted and implementing those different statutes. So it's kind of a functionality that exists in there, and a lot of our conversation today is going to build on that with other housing laws that we're going to talk about. Just a note here, the codes that were adopted in 2025 already include a couple of modules that implement different housing laws. 3 examples that are here include middle housing additions. This is a provision that was added by House Bill 2138 that allows kind of siting of middle housing in conjunction with existing development. Middle housing land divisions, which I just talked about. This is just an example of one that's kind of pictured right here on the screen. And then limited land use decisions, kind of another procedure that applies to certain types of housing that has kind of provisions that are set forth in statute. The model code provides a module that implements that statute directly. So again, any of these are modules that are available for local governments as an option to comply with the housing law if their local codes do not conform yet. All right, I got 2 more functions, and then we'll kind of take a quick break to pause for questions. I can see there's already some populating, but I'm going to move over to talking through kind of guidance and promising practice. I'm not going to spend as much time talking about this because it's more about kind of Goal 10 planning, and there's a whole presentation around what Goal 10 is and what it requires. That would be a little bit too much for the scope of this presentation because we're not really focusing on that part in this work. But I do want to talk about it. So in short, Goal 10 has requirements for cities above 10,000 in population on kind of a regular periodic schedule to be planning for different housing types and to be planning different actions that they can take to support production, affordability, and choice in their communities, right? And part of that includes planning for, say, regulating development in a way that is more conducive to housing production, right? So that's like a consideration that local governments will have to think about in their the work that they undertake as part of their obligations under Goal 10. And right now, model codes in that kind of framework are what we would call a safe harbor. Basically, if a city's thinking, hey, how can we support the development of middle housing or plan for this need for middle housing? Model codes are available as a resource that says, hey, this model code, if you implement this optionally, it's an optional course of action that they can take, you can be sure that it's sanctioned under the rules as a measure that's definitely good enough to plan for middle housing need. Now, one question that kind of emerges out of there is like, hey, is it exactly the model ordinance that we would have to implement to do this? We have different ways of regulating development. Maybe we can achieve similar development outcomes, but in a different way than how the model ordinance does, right? And basically what this rule puts out there is, yeah, that's totally fine. How would you actually demonstrate what those outcomes look like to be comparable to the model code? So it goes into a lot of detail about what that means, what that what the outcomes or results of a local code would be. It really kind of helps operationalize it if a city chooses as part of their safe harbor in their Goal 10 planning process to implement a model code to provide that kind of additional flexibility. But again, not the focus of today's presentation. I will also talk about one more tool that's kind of in this, and this is probably going to be the least invoked or least common use of model codes, which is around the LCDC enforcement order. For those that might not be unaware, LCDC, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, which I mentioned previously, also has a role in the enforcement of housing laws, right? So they enforce kind of requirements that exist around Goal 10, housing planning, but also around making sure that, there's kind of like fulfillment of different obligations that exist under housing laws. And one of the kind of most significant tools that they have is an enforcement order, which can compel a local government to come into compliance with a particular law or particular goal. And something I'll add about this is kind of a tool of last resort. For the most part, LCDC enforcement orders tend to be fairly rare, and there's always, options for compliance that exist well in advance of this. This is really kind of intended as a tool of last resort. But as part of that process, one of the things that the commission is authorized to do is to require the application of a model ordinance or model procedures to the development of housing while a city is kind of coming into compliance with the enforcement order. And basically what this rule does is kind of outline the parameters. How does that function? How does it relate with a city's code? When is it effective and when does it sunset, right? As part of that. And so that's basically what this rule does. Again, this will not be the focus of today's presentation, again, because this is intended to be a pretty small tool and we're really going to be focusing on housing law compliance. Now, before I move into talking about where we're going and some of the work that we're going to be doing in 2026 around that kind of housing law compliance piece, I'll take a minute just to pause and see what questions we have that we can help answer. So I'm going to stop sharing just for a second here so we can kind of see what questions we've gotten so far and see if we can respond to them. Yeah. Kieran, you want to help me navigate the QA and any questions that we've received so far?
Yeah, so we have one from Jason asking, do the model codes adopted in December 2025 in any way implement the middle housing law changes contained in the relevant middle housing sections of House Bill 2138 from the 2025 session?
Yeah, I can speak to that. The answer is yes. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we get into the next half of the presentation, but something to know about the model codes that were adopted in 2025 is that they do explicitly conform to the statutory requirements of House Bill 2138 with a caveat, which is that House Bill 2138 directs LCDC to do rulemaking over the next couple of years to implement new middle housing statutes, right? So LCDC, there's going to be a whole process that happens. It's underway right now. Where they're going to basically establish rules implementing these new laws, right? Like the new provisions around cottage clusters and plexes and bonus units, all that type of stuff. It needs to undergo that process. And so the model code that was adopted at the end of 2025, it conforms with the law, but we also anticipate like, hey, we're going to have to update this later once that rulemaking process concludes. And that's intentional with these codes. They're going to be updated on a regular basis, recognizing that housing laws change, right? And so that way we can help kind of provide that resource to local governments around having kind of up-to-date codes that conform with these different laws as they're amended. But you can be sure right now that the code as adopted does actually conform with those different statutes, at least until administrative rules are adopted. And of course, we expect to have to come back to them to conform with any administrative rules that are adopted. So do you want to read the next question? Is it?
Oh yeah, it just came in. I think it's, yeah, Jason again. With regard to the 2026 middle housing rulemaking, what is the timeline of that compared to the law's required implementation date of 2027 and 28 for cottage clusters?
Yeah. So my understanding of this, and again, something to know here is that the Housing Division is leading the rulemaking for middle housing, right? HAPO is not leading that effort. But as we understand it, House Bill 2138 establishes a couple of implementation deadlines for different provisions. For rulemaking, it sets out a deadline for LCDC to adopt new rules for middle housing on January 1st of 2028. I believe that's the deadline. And then for implementation, it prescribes two deadlines. One is January 1st of 2027 for most of the provisions in the law, and then January 1st of 2028 for changes that are specific to cottage clusters, right? So there's kind of two implementation deadlines built into there. Importantly, one of those implementation deadlines is before the rulemaking deadline. So January 1st of 2027 are changes that are related to other things. So, right, that is kind of an implementation question that folks are going to have to consider, which is like, all right, do we adopt code amendments right now and then wait until rulemaking is complete to see if we need to adopt conforming amendments down the line, or do we basically wait and see to see how rulemaking lands? And of course, in the interim, after that deadline passes, apply a model ordinance that is kind of prescribed in that process around middle housing implementation. That's a choice that every city or county that's affected is going to have to make. All right. Do we have other questions that we need to look into, or does anybody, have anything, raise your hands if you have any questions about the model code functionality? Oh, I'm also seeing we have an offer from somebody to on the housing division to talk through House Bill 2138 rulemaking. So I am actually going to invite Ethan, if you're on the call, please feel free to jump on and kind of provide any information about that House Bill 2138 rulemaking.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And hi, everyone. This is Ethan Stuckmeyer, manage the housing division at DLCD. The rulemaking that you're speaking to, Sean and Jason, is kicking off, I'll say, in earnest in August of 2026, and will continue through December 2027 in accordance with the statutory deadlines for conclusion of that rulemaking that Sean outlined, which, again, for a reminder, the rules need to be adopted by the Land Conservation and Development Commission by January 1st, 2028. And the point that you're highlighting, Jason, is and Sean, is that there are some timelines that don't necessarily match up very well with that time frame. There's a couple things to offset that. The first is one of the provisions related to the definition of cottage cluster that changed in our 2138 will be expedited in the rulemaking process. And so while I say rulemaking for 2138 is kicking off in earnest in August, actually we'll be doing some work pre-August and kind of leading up to an adoption by the commission in actually August of 2026 related to the definition of cottage cluster. So that'll happen as part of what we're calling phase 1 of that rulemaking, which is tied in with the Oregon Homes program, and it's kind of a 2-phase rulemaking approach. So that piece, the cottage cluster definition, will be completed by August of 2026 so that local governments can begin to make that decision that Sean is describing in terms of updating their codes to comply with those new rules. I also do want to highlight too that the statute 2138 authorizes the Land Conservation and Development Commission to articulate implementation deadlines for some of the provisions in 2138, which will be part of that rulemaking process to identify what are those implementation timeframes to allow local governments the time and space to actually make those code amendments and updates. Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, thank you, Ethan. All right, hopefully that was responsive to your question. Jason, feel free to raise your hand if you have any follow-ups. All right, well, unless anybody else has any questions, I'm going to continue moving on and talking through some of the different compliance modules that we'll be working on. So let me reshare my screen. All right. All right, hopefully folks are able to see that. And let's move on to talking through kind of what's in store for 2026. So as mentioned kind of previously, at the end of 2025, the Land Conservation and Development Commission kind of adopted a set of model codes that fulfilled the legislative direction in Senate Bill 1564, right? And so kind of a follow-up question is, all right, what needs to happen next, right, around kind of development of other kind of model ordinances, that type of thing? Like, why would HAPO be working on or building on this kind of framework of what's been adopted in the law already? And the short answer to that is that we're directed to. So as part of our duties that are set forth in statute, ORS Chapter 197A 800, there's a variety of duties that are articulated in subsection 2 of that law, but one of them is that our office, HAPO, shall establish best practices related to model codes procedures and practices by which local governments may comply with housing laws. And that there is just building code related stuff, which is, obviously not our expertise. But as part of that, basically, the legislature's directed, all right, HAPO, go forth and develop kind of best practices that relate to model code to help support the implementation of different housing laws. And to kind of basically lean into that direction, what we're going to be working on is a set of new compliance modules over the course of this year to kind of help aid local compliance or conforming amendments that local governments will be doing with new housing laws. And there's kind of two underlying purposes that drive this. One is to be an implementation resource for local governments. As I mentioned before, right, just relying on the statutes alone is a very difficult prospect for a lot of different local governments to keep up with in terms of, different changes that happen to the law, X, Y, and Z. And of course, it can be very challenging to get the resources necessary to do conforming amendments. This is designed to help with that. But in addition, it's also intended to help be a resource to help actually facilitate the housing production that these housing laws kind of intend to unlock, right? So to be a resource around, hey, these different laws that the legislature has adopted explicitly to help support production, really provide that tool that can really help kind of bring it to that next level and actually get these units built on the ground. So it kind of has that dual purpose as part of that. And basically is the main reason why we're leaning into this direction and as part of 2026 and really focusing in on some housing laws that the legislature has adopted that really don't have a whole lot of implementation support or any kind of framework around it, right? And so these next slides, I'll be talking through some of the laws that we've identified as like, oh, this is something that could really use a module to help aid local implementation. And we'll go through the whole thing. Again, I'll pause for questions at the end and we can kind of talk through some of the specific ones. But I'll start by talking through mandatory adjustments. So this is a housing law that came out of the 2024 session in Senate Bill 1537. That was the governor's housing production package, and that year is a big housing omnibus. Among a lot of the different policies that were passed was a requirement, a temporary policy that sunsets in January 2nd of 2032. Basically requiring different local governments to grant flexibility to specific kinds of land use regulations for developments that meet specific requirements that are set out in statute. I won't go into the details on like all the different standards that are included or all of the different qualifications for development. We've talked about it in the past, but the short of it is there's the statute that exists that right now, for the most part, local governments kind of lean on implementing the statute directly. And so what would be very helpful is a model ordinance that can help kind of provide that resource to local governments, especially those that wouldn't be planning on doing conforming amendments before the bill sunsets in January 2nd of 2032. So that's one example. Pictured here, this is actually an example of one of the first housing developments that was able to make use of the housing adjustments to be able to move forward and to break ground. So this is the Owens Adair 2 apartments. They're in Astoria. It's an affordable housing project that also includes housing for kind of, I believe it's low income seniors and people with disabilities. They're actually some of the first folks that made use of the mandatory adjustments in order to help enable their project to move forward. And again, this is intended to be a resource explicitly to help these types of projects move forward. And of course, to help the local government, give them a tool to make that process easy. Moving on. We'll talk through a couple of housing laws that were included as part of Senate Bill 974. For those that are familiar, this was a bill that was passed during the 2025 legislative session. And there's kind of three main kind of provisions that are included in this bill that we're kind of looking at as part of this. And I'll start with one that's a little bit uncertain. The first part of the bill articulates a process called final engineering review. It's a process that kind of sets out certain public works reviews that occur after a tentative plat. And, it has deadlines, it has provisions that are kind of established in there around how that procedure looks like. Something to know about this one is it's actually not a housing law. So the bill didn't specify what chapter it would be codified in, but once the dust settled in 2026 on codification, this specific provision, ended up in ORS chapter 195. And because of that, it's actually not a housing law. So something that we're kind of wondering here is like, hey, we've heard from local governments that this would be a great thing to have some kind of resource to help them implement, but it's not a housing law. So like, how do we actually navigate that? We don't know the answer to that question yet. So just something to kind of put a little asterisk on that one. But there are two other housing policies in there that are definitely housing laws. The first one are kind of administrative, kind of procedural requirements for certain types of land use applications. That includes planned unit developments, variances, and certain kinds of zone changes. Basically, it sets out this process by which these types of applications occur under a more kind of administrative review procedure, and kind of sets out like different processes and limitations that exist therein that local governments need to abide with. And basically the idea here would be kind of developing a procedure that implements that section so that way folks have something they can lean on. And then the last provision is around a kind of temporary policy that relates to what are called residential design standards. In the bill, in short, residential design standards are a kind of design standard that really focuses on regulating kind of the aesthetic or character or architectural expression of residential development. And what this policy does is it requires exempting certain types of qualifying residential development applications from applying these standards. So if there is a project that contains 20 or more units as part of it, there's requirements basically to exempt certain types of residential design standards as part of that. And this is a policy that also sunsets, I believe it's January 2nd of 2033. But again, kind of a question there of like, hey, how do we actually support implementation of this? The intent would be to develop a module that helps support local governments in doing that. All right. Moving on, and by the way, for all of these, we'll pause at the end if folks have questions on any individual one. So definitely feel free to start thinking about those and getting those in the queue. I'll move on now to residential homes and facilities. This is an existing housing law. It's currently codified in ORS Chapter 197, 660 to 667, and it was amended by a bill that happened pretty late in the 2025 session called House Bill 2005. Now, something to know about this is it establishes kind of a new, pretty broad supersiding requirement for what are called residential treatment homes and facilities, which are kind of like a subset of residential homes and facilities. And it's a pretty broad supersiding requirement that applies on most lands inside of an urban growth boundary. That's codified in ORS Chapter 197A, 385. And basically, the idea behind this effort is to not only provide model ordinances that implement the existing statute, but also to implement this new direction under House Bill 2005 around residential treatment homes and facilities. Something I'll also add in here, there is a provision in this bill that isn't a housing law because there's also a second provision that allows for broad supersiding for what are called crisis stabilization centers and mental/psychiatric hospitals. The reason why this is not a housing law is because neither of these two things are housing, which part of the definition of housing law is that it has to relate to residential development. So we're actually not going to be developing a model code that relates to this law for that reason. All right. Moving on, I'm going to be talking now about just kind of actually a bundle of different housing laws that we kind of refer to collectively as the by right affordable housing statutes. In short, the legislature has had a number of laws over past years that are really designed to kind of make the siting of affordable housing, so housing with kind of like restrictive covenants that make them affordable to different household incomes. The legislature has adopted a number of policies that are really intended to make that process easy, to give them, by right or without like conditional use permits or zone changes, the ability to site affordable housing in different kind of contexts that are specified by the legislature. And there's a whole host of statutes that implement this. Examples include ORS 197A 445. A recent one that was adopted was the Homestart Lands Bill, which was codified in 197A 447. There are provisions around hotel conversions to affordable housing. That's in 449. And then also there's another one for affordable housing that's on commercial lands that's articulated in Section 460. And there's also kind of procedural requirements for affordable housing applications that are set out in 470. So the intent here would be to develop modules that basically can be implemented that implement these different by right affordable housing statutes that local governments, again, rather than having to codify each one of these statutes individually, they can take these modules and apply them if an application actually comes through the door. So that's kind of the intent around this particular subset of work. And of course, this picture right over here, these are just examples of, I believe, some Homestart lands that is also a program that DAS is administering to help support use of state lands for housing production. All right. And then this last piece that we're going to talk about, this one is going to take a little bit of setup because we have to explain a little bit about the rulemaking that's happening. Ethan came on and talked about that rulemaking process a little bit, but the short of it is there are two bills that were passed, House Bill 2138, that's for middle housing, and then House Bill 2258, and that's for Oregon homes, which is kind of like a permit-ready plan approval process. And both of these bills basically direct the housing division, or direct LCDC specifically, to adopt rules kind of implementing the different provisions that exist for both of them. And so what we want to kind of emphasize here is we basically at HAPO, we have existing kind of authorization to, kind of contract support for model code development. And we know that this process is basically underway. There's going to be a whole bunch of conversations that happen around middle housing, that happen around all these different types of things. But as far as we know it, a lot of the planners that are going to be leading that process aren't actually hired yet. And it'd be very difficult for them to undergo the RFP process, which is generally a process that takes about 6 months, and to also be able to complete the rulemaking process. So in short, we're basically lending them code support, right? We have these existing resources to help kind of develop model codes. But there's kind of the questions that they're going to need to answer in that process around, all right, how do we handle model codes in the context of House Bill 2138 and 2258? What are the decisions that we need to make? And then, of course, they can basically make use of the resources that we offer, the technical support to produce those codes. But we won't be actually engaging in those policy discussions. We'll be deferring to our colleagues in the housing division to do that, right? And so that'll also be kind of a part of this process of basically, we'll be developing these, but we're not actually the ones who are going to be leading the policy discussions on what those model codes should include. We're just providing this support so that way that planner is not going to need to also undergo their own RFP process, which is kind of it's a whole heck of a lot to do in a short period of time. If you'd like to follow that process, again, as Ethan mentioned, it's underway right now. This is a link to our rulemaking page where there's more information on this rulemaking process. I believe it's called the More Homes Rulemaking, so it's a really slick acronym. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of great conversations that happen there. And of course, as mentioned previously with Jason's question, something to know is that the housing model codes that were adopted at the end of last year are conforming with 2138 currently. So that's also just something to be aware of as you think about this, is that those codes were adopted to conform, recognizing that rulemaking process is going to play out, and we're going to update it later to handle any changes that happen in administrative rules. So that's the main thing to know there. And I think with that, I believe that covers the scope of basically all the different laws that we intend to basically develop over this year. And I just wanted to basically kind of cover the invitation to provide feedback on all these different codes. So this is something that we're going to be working on basically over the next couple of months. In the next couple of months, we plan on basically publishing kind of a set of guidance materials and TA support for local governments that seek to kind of implement different provisions in the model code. And then kind of in August, we're shooting to have a set of draft statutory modules that are available for public comment and public testimony. So that's something to look forward to. We'll make a big announcement via our Gov Delivery to invite folks to be able to review and to provide comments on different model ordinances or draft model ordinances that we published. And then we anticipate kind of adoption of these to occur in January of 2027 as LCDC will consider it alongside kind of some rulemaking that they tend to do around this time. And just to know also, this work is not the end of model ordinances 2. We expect that the legislature is going to keep legislating. And of course, we expect that we're going to need to make future updates to codes as those updates happen in the law and in administrative rules. So that's just something to be aware of, is that we anticipate these to be living documents. And so we'll be continuing to update as changes happen. And of course, just to encourage, if you're not already signed up for our Gov Delivery to track this process, I encourage signing up. We have a link right here in this slide, and we encourage you to follow that process and provide your feedback once we publish these for public comment in August. So I think with that, we can move now into kind of our office hours and question and answer. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and just kind of open the floor for different questions folks might have, and other questions that might not even be model ordinance related. Great. I see Matt Straight raised his hand. Go ahead, Matt.
I wasn't sure if you guys have given this much thought. I'm probably jumping the gun in my city because I'm already starting to adopt some of these changes in my code, and maybe I should
Sure.
be waiting to get more guidance from you folks on what they mean. But the one that's specific to eliminating design standards for projects over 20,
Sure.
I'm not sure how exactly to implement that. Because if it's a subdivision that's got more than 20 units, do we put some kind of regulation or condition of approval on that subdivision that says we can't do the design standards? The designs of the homes come after the subdivision is recorded. And
Mhm.
so I'm not sure how to work that one. Have you guys given that much thought yet?
Yeah, and the short answer is the bill doesn't say, or the statute doesn't say specifically. So, the provision around residential design standards, it applies to development applications that include 20 or more units. And kind of one of the questions that we've received this actually a number of times, is around, well, how do you do sequencing for this? Do you, like if we have a subdivision where we don't apply residential design standards, does that mean you're not able to apply them later at the building permit stage, things like that? And the short answer is the statute doesn't say, and we would be unable to interpret the statute without adopting rules. Now, model ordinances are adopted by rule. So if there's kind of a desire, right, to say like, hey, this would be great for some clarification on how we sequence, residential design standards in the application process in a way that, conforms with the statute and implements it, that would be something I would encourage kind of raising when we publish this, and you're like, hey, I'd really like to know more on the sequencing question, and like how this actually works. But that is something that we're tracking. That's something that we're aware of. And kind of adoption of model ordinances gives us the ability to say, well, this is a code that you can definitely rely on that implements that provision. So if you guys see those kind of like ambiguities, definitely let us know, and we can kind of help think about it and incorporate it into any model ordinances that we produce.
Sean, it looks like we have a couple more in the Q&A function. So one from Megan asking that you mentioned that the development of mental/psychiatric hospitals isn't considered housing. Who decides that? With so much of the homeless population looking for supportive housing services, is someone else working on that?
Yeah, let me start with the question around, so the specific bill provision, there's kind of two components that are included in House Bill 2005. One is for what are called licensed crisis stabilization centers, and another is for mental or psychiatric hospitals. So crisis stabilization center is actually a defined term. I don't have the definition right in front of me, but we had reviewed it to say, like, what is a crisis stabilization center? Is it residential? Is it a residential use? And the answer is basically the definition did not include any reference to residential uses at all. There's actually nothing that's residential about it in the definition. And kind of similarly, mental or psychiatric hospitals, that was not defined anywhere in statute. So we actually don't have a definition to hang our hats on. But generally speaking, a hospital's not housing. So, I mean, in terms of who decides that, I mean, to the extent that we have something in statute that tells us that this is residential uses, that would be what would make it a housing law. But so far, we don't really have anything in the definitions that really point to these being residential uses. So.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And we have another one from Becca asking that you mentioned the timeline regulations on final engineering review plans under Senate Bill 974 not being a housing law, and therefore having uncertainty as to whether DLCD can support local jurisdictions with implementing this. When will DLCD receive clarity on your role with this position on Senate Bill 974?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is a good question. I think part of it is when something is a housing law, that means it's part of HAPO's kind of broader statutory authority to be a resource on basically for local governments and for housing producers. And kind of just as a quirk of like how this law was codified, basically put it outside of that definition because it's, in a totally different chapter that's not articulated in the definition of housing laws. So that means basically that statute is kind of outside of our statutory authority. But the question that we have is like, well, folks still want support and resources for this. So do we have any existing statutory authority, say, for example, to develop a model code? Maybe it's guidance, maybe it's, X, Y, and Z, maybe it's a provision where we say, hey, this is a thing that we've provided and adopted into rule, but it's not a housing law, it doesn't implement a housing law, that kind of thing. We would need to explore that. And we would have an answer to that basically by the time we reach August, and whether we adopt one or not, or choose to adopt one or not, right, based on kind of that question. So, I mean, of course, this could always be a lot clearer for us if there was a statutory fix. Just to clarify, that final engineering review is a housing law, but that would require a statutory amendment.
To kind of build off your point, Sean, just for the benefit of the greater group, I've pasted in the chat a link to a document we created that kind of defines what housing laws are, shows what parts of statute are housing laws, and they can kind of give you like a general sense of the scope, noting that this was last updated in June 25, 2025 as well. So not the most updated version with the current legislative session's recent additions to what housing laws are.
Yeah. Basically, it wasn't updated after the 2025 session. So, but we're planning a broader set of kind of like something to supplant this guidance. But it's still a good resource for now. It just know it's not including some of those new housing laws that were adopted in the 2025 session. All right. Well, we can, take questions on model ordinances if folks have them. We're also happy to, just open this up if folks have other types of questions. Maybe, if there's anything relating to housing laws that you have. Of course, we're just here to make space and see what issues folks are grappling with and what we can be helpful for. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
I posted this question in the chat too. Can you walk us through what some of the deadlines are for many of these housing bills that you're working on right now, as far as the city side, and when we have to have them adopted by?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So let's start. I think House Bill 2138 is the only bill that I am aware of that establishes an implementation deadline. All the other ones are basically they, changed the law and they were effective at specific dates that are specified in the bill. Most often, it's going to be on signature if it's a bill that is adopted like as an emergency. But the bill that I'm aware of that has implementation deadlines is House Bill 2138. So that's the bill that basically kind of changes the middle housing statutes to, kind of provide more flexibility for middle housing development and all the different provisions in there. The bill sets out an implementation deadline of January 1st of 2027 for most of the amendments, and then January 1st of 2028 for changes that are specific to cottage clusters. So that's the big kind of deadline that we're aware of that folks should be tracking. But beyond that, most of the other bills that I've talked about are really just effective right now. So it's kind of part of the reason why we're going to be working on these model code modules is to really provide that implementation resource for local governments, just in case an application comes through the door, right? As you guys are working on code amendments, or maybe not even working on code amendments, right? If you don't have the resources to do that. Does that get at your question? Okay, great. All right, Megan, please feel free.
Awesome. Hi, you guys have done an awesome job. I'm new to HAPO, so I'm kind of learning as we go, but was wondering if you could talk about some other examples of ways you've helped get development across the finish line. You mentioned that project in Astoria. Do you guys have some other examples of what you've been able to do? And is it you working with cities or jurisdictions? Are you educating developers? Like what role specifically are you trying to play to, promote housing? Just so I can better understand. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I'll maybe start us off and I'll see Joel, Kieran, if you guys have some things that you want to contribute to with like some specific stories or that kind of thing. But in short, we're directed to be kind of a resource both for local governments and for housing developers, really with a goal around helping facilitate housing production on the ground, right? Leaning into a collaborative approach to support that production on the ground. And there's different ways that we can do that, different ways that we're directed to do that in statute. This is just kind of one of those ways that we're supposed to be doing this in terms of development of model ordinances that help implement housing laws. But a big part of what we do, I'd say there's kind of a few things that we do. One is that we are kind of a resource on different housing laws. So a big part of kind of our bread and butter of daily work is just around kind of like answering questions that folks have about different housing laws. We call this kind of informal guidance or informal inquiries that we receive that are, maybe a local government's doing code amendments and they are, wondering like, all right, how do we handle this situation, X, Y, and Z? And we can provide them guidance on that. Or oftentimes we'll have a developer reach out and they say, hey, we're thinking about doing an application in this particular community, and we would really like to know more about what laws say about, duplexes or something like that. And that's where we can provide a lot of guidance on those different types of issues, and of course, provide that guidance to the local government as well, so they're aware of it. And so that's a big part of like a lot of what we do, and oftentimes that is often like that helps move projects forward when people understand what the law says about kind of different provisions. It can really be a helpful starting point for anything that might even turn out to be a conflict that comes down the line. I'll also add that we have a role around kind of navigation of different state agencies. I'll lean on Karen to describe that in a minute, which is where we kind of help folks navigate different existing state agencies, policies, programs, resources to help kind of unstick different development projects, and they can speak more to that. But then also we have a role around what we would call formal complaints. Basically, right, sometimes, right, there can be a potential violation of housing laws that a developer might want our office to investigate in a formal capacity. We have a process for that to occur where we, basically kind of see if this is in our statutory authority to investigate, and then if it is, we kind of launch an investigation just to get an understanding of what the facts are and to see if there's a violation occurring. And again, oftentimes this is a place where we can be kind of a resource to really help like unstick projects or, help facilitate voluntary compliance at the local level. We really lead with like, hey, we have resources. We want to help support you in kind of complying with these different housing laws to help support, this project moving forward. And of course, you guys coming into conformance with the law. So that's something that we've been leaning into so far. We actually have a really good case example of that with our first complaint in John Day, where that's basically exactly what happened, right? We found, that we started an investigation and basically we were able to help the project move along with connecting the local government with desperately needed resources to help fix their code, right? And so it's a big part of how we function. But I'll pass it on over to Kieran and Joel to see if they have other examples they'd like to highlight, especially around navigation, which I'm not as directly involved with.
Yeah, Joel, unless you want to go, I can talk a little bit about navigation. But essentially, we know that the state has many agencies that touch housing production, and oftentimes it can be difficult to find the right person to talk to, or difficult to find the right program that affects your project or various other kind of needs you might have. So the navigation side of our office is really committed to just helping you find the right person or navigate other state programs or policies that might impact your housing project. So that it could include looking at funding opportunities, grants, financing that the state offers, but also looking at the regulatory side of things, looking at what permitting that the state administers that might impact housing production, and how might we be able to collaborate with state agencies to look at your project and see how we could assist there.
Yeah, and Joel, if you have anything to add. No, that's fine.
Great job.
Yeah, but
both Sean and Kieran focused on the work of HAPO at, the project specific level, which is helping to, it's grounded in advancing housing production, helping to get to producing units. Our office does also work in the research and evaluation kind of realm. And so we currently have 2 studies that we're working on focused on the local residential development process, looking for ways to increase efficiencies, make improvements in that regard. So we're excited to see what results can come from that work. And the other study that we're actively working on is the program and policy evaluation. So an inward facing study at the state enterprise, looking at those programs that work well to advance housing production, and also trying to identify opportunities for improvement across existing programs at the state enterprise. So again, HAPO is focused at that project level as well as kind of the more systemic level for support on housing production.
Awesome. Thank you for the high level overview. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Megan. And to Joel's point, I put a link in the chat that has some more information on both those studies if you're interested in checking it out. But I think we also have a couple other questions in the Q&A. So Elizabeth asked, have you been following any bills in the short session that may further affect housing laws?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can speak to that. So there is, actually, I'll say for the most part, the short session has been relatively quiet in terms of bills that affect housing laws. But there is one that I've been tracking, and there's a couple of provisions in there that do affect existing housing laws. One, it's House Bill 4037. It's a bill that includes kind of two main kind of changes to existing housing laws. One is that it amends the clear and objective statute to kind of establish some procedural limitations on projects that undergo clear and objective review around like noticing, hearings, and kind of ability to appeal a decision. Again, this bill is not passed yet, so it's kind of difficult to talk about it in concrete terms because we don't actually know like what the final language is. But the other provision is around it affects 197A 445. So that's one of those by right affordable housing statutes I mentioned. And it includes kind of like a caveat to that the requirement in the statute to allow affordable housing, specifically in areas that are kind of designated in like a master plan or something like that as a mixed use area. And so there's kind of some limitations that exist for the statute in those types of areas that the bill kind of also includes. But really, I mean, that's about it actually, as far as bills that affect housing laws that we are aware of.
And we have another one from Jason. Jason asked, in implementing local code changes related to the model codes, do cities have copyright permission to use the illustrations in the model code in our own local publications?
Yes. So any model codes that we produce, we clarify that these are basically the state of Oregon's to provide as a resource to folks. So yeah, in developing those illustrations, we made them with the explicit intent to be able to share those with folks, so that way they can use them on the ground. So yeah, please feel free to make use of those illustrations.
And then Dick asks, will there be guidance on single room occupancies, or do we just follow ORS 197A 430? House Bill 3395 requires jurisdictions to approve emergency housing. Is it implementation separate from development codes?
Yeah, so something to know about single room occupancies in 197A 430 is that House Bill 2138 kind of directs rulemaking on single room occupancies. So it's kind of bundled with that statute. So basically it's part of the what we would anticipate to be part of that work program, whether we develop model ordinances that relate to implementing single room occupancies. We basically know that there's going to be administrative rules that are adopted on it. And so a lot of those conversations are going to happen as part of that rulemaking process, but we're aware and are prepared to basically produce a model code on it, assuming that's what that process yields.
And that was the last question I see in the Q&A chat.
Great. All right. Well, we still have maybe about 27 minutes here if folks have any other questions that they'd like to ask us, model code or otherwise.
Yeah, Dick, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Dick, if you're trying to speak, you're still on mute, but please go ahead and take yourself off mute and
I'm having trouble with my mic. I was
we can
wondering
hear you
about.
now. Yeah.
Okay, now we go. Thank you. I didn't hear the answer on the emergency housing. I know that's through 3395. It seems like it's separate from development codes, but I just want to be sure of that.
Potentially, what section are you referring to?
Well, it was 3395 and the whole emergency housing.
Right. What
there's
section though?
I don't have it in front of me. I'm sorry.
Okay.
There was the provision that clearly allowed motels to be converted to emergency housing, but there was the other that just talked about various nonprofits, government agencies. Those kinds of folks could provide the emergency housing, but it sounded like it was separate from a model, from a development code. I'm just curious as how we get that implemented.
Okay, so I think this is about the conversion of a hotel to an emergency shelter. That's not defined as a housing law under our kind of like broad umbrella of statutory authority. I believe. I don't know where exactly this is codified, but it is a shelter.
Okay, and that would be the same for the other variations of emergency housing, I think. I'll look at it further.
It depends. I mean, in this case, it's specifically a shelter, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know where it's codified exactly, but our statutory authority is very specific. So like, for example, we actually do have a law that requires allowing the conversion of a motel to affordable housing. That is a housing law.
Okay.
So that's just something to be aware of.
Yeah, that's the distinction.
Mhm.
Thank you.
All right. Other questions? Well, then, I think we can then, maybe just talk about next steps. So something I'll encourage if you're, sitting around, you think you like have a question that's like, oh my gosh, I should have asked this during the meeting. Don't hesitate to basically reach out to us. We have an intake form where we can kind of facilitate and solicit different, inquiries that folks might have or answer any questions that we have after this meeting. So you're always able to reach out to us there. I'll see if I'll paste a link into the chat. Give me 1 second. And I think beyond that, I'll just thank everybody for joining in today, and I'll pass it back to Joel to see if he has any parting words of wisdom.
Well, thanks, Sean, and thanks again to those of you who have joined us here this afternoon. I did see Megan Howard put a question in the chat just now about asking how long will HAPO be around. Well, we're just getting going, and hopefully are being a resource to, again, both housing producers and local jurisdictions. So HAPO does not, as an office, we do not have a date by which we're not anticipating being around. So really looking forward to leaning up into this work alongside of you and others. Again, thanks for participating in the open forum. Tune in next month, first Monday of the month, where the housing division will be hosting the open forum. HAPO will be back with the open forum in May, that first week of May. So take a minute to look in the chat to see if you want to pull down or save any of the links that we've provided from the complaint and intake form link to the link on the legislative reports that HAPO is working on. We also shared link on the model code and other housing laws that are associated with our office. So again, thank you all for your participation. Thank you, Sean and Kieran, for leading in the presentation this afternoon. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.